Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. My talk is entitled "The Church Triumphant: Second Presbyterian from the Gilded Age through World War II, Crisis, Building, and Burden." That is it's a broad span of time for a 1-hour lecture. And I'll do my very best. Are you still having trouble? Can you hear me all right? Okay. So let's get started. And what I'm going to do is replow some of David's old ground from 2 weeks ago. And I'm going to start out by talking about the Reverend Stuart Robinson and his vast influence on Second Presbyterian Church. This is the stained glass window that is in our narthex. I've always referred to it as the window of sacred humanism, because in the window are famous Presbyterians like Augustine of Hippo, Bach, Madame Curie. They were all Presbyterians. No, not really. they were people that the senior pastor at the time, Glenn Doris, wanted in the window because he thought that they represented important milestones in well-being, in health, and in just basic decency and talent. And in the window are certain individuals. So let me show you here first the window itself. This is the Reverend Stuart Robinson in the window in the narthex, and above him is the church that he built in 1874. And now here is the picture that you can see when you're here in the church and you're walking in from the administrative offices, and you see all the ministers are framed. And that is actually a photograph of him that was taken. He was the minister at Second from 1858 until 1881. But there was a 4-year sort of interregnum where he was not the minister of Second Presbyterian Church because he had fled to Canada to escape Union troops who were coming after him. This is the portrait that you see over here on the easel. Please do not tell the House and Gardens that it's here. I promise to put it back. And for those of you on Zoom, you're getting a good close-up of him. This is not the original portrait. It is a copy. I don't know which descendant has the original. Stuart Robinson is an intrinsically interesting person in the history of Louisville, Kentucky, and of the Second Presbyterian Church. He was born in 1814. He died in 1881. He, as I said, was our minister from 1858 until 1881. He was very smart. He was born in Ireland. He had a childhood injury where he had a withered arm throughout the rest of his life. He graduated from Amherst College in Massachusetts, and he got his ministerial degree from Princeton. He received a Doctor of Divinity degree, which would be, I think, the equivalent these days of what one would call a D.Min, from Center, where he taught for several years. How many of you are familiar with the First Presbyterian Church in Frankfort, Kentucky? Yeah, we did. He built the First Presbyterian. He was the pastor of that church when that Gothic revival building was done, and it was beautiful. And then he also founded, or helped the congregation founded, the South Frankfurt Presbyterian Church, which is still an active congregation in Frankfurt as well. This was back in the days when larger, prosperous churches were evangelizing by building or starting smaller congregations that could then grow. We'll get into that during this talk. After his pastorate in Frankfurt, and oh, by the way, he was on the board of a bank in Frankfurt, and that was where he learned some of his most important business skills, I believe. He joined the Danville Theological Seminary in Danville, Kentucky, which is, at that time, it was part of Center College. He died, as I said, in 81 and received the title Pastor Emeritus. And that was the first time in either the Southern Church or the Northern Church that such a title had been given. So Stuart, in so many ways, was a trailblazer. He can best be described as a clergyman, but also a financier, an editor, an educator, a lecturer, a real estate investor, a business advisor, and a litigant. At Center, he encountered his lifelong enemy, the Reverend Robert J. Breckinridge. Breckinridge was a Unionist, although he was an enslaver, but he believed in the path of what we'll call gradual emancipation. There were in Kentucky abolitionists represented by the Reverend David Rice, who is buried on Center's grounds at that First Presbyterian Church. He was a generation ahead. Then we get to Breckinridge and Stuart Robinson. Stuart Robinson, boy, he was a strong, principled man who saw life, I think it's fair to say, in his own lights. And by that, I mean he believed in the Confederate cause. He thought that it was a bad thing that the Northern churchmen in the Presbyterian Church were dictating to the Southern people what their churches ought to be doing and saying. And there came a time in the history of the denomination when the Northern Church, right at the beginning of the Civil War, insisted that the Southern churches swear allegiance to the Union, and that the Southern churches refused to do. And Robinson was one of the principal people in that battle. Additionally, because of that, and because of things that he wrote that were pro-slavery and pro-separation, pro-Confederacy, he was on the hit list for Union troops who were bivouacked in Louisville. He fled to Canada along with other individuals and went to Toronto. And while in Toronto, he wrote basically pieces supporting the Confederacy, supporting the Confederate cause. Then, while all of this was going on, he owned two houses, both on Central Park. His first house was smaller, it no longer stands, and he sold that to one of the DuPonts who had moved to Louisville for money-making ventures they were engaged in here. The other house still stands. The other house I got to go into yesterday as I was preparing. It is the Lanyard House. It's surrounded by a tall brick wall, and it is 3 stories high. It has a limestone front. It's Italianate. I wish I thought to take a picture of it for you, but I didn't. It is really a magnificent house. One of the lawyers who was there let me come inside. And so you walk in and the house is massive. It is, it could be beautiful, and it's just, gone down over the years, but it has a notable history. One, because he lived there. Two, because ultimately, a woman lived there for many, many years. Her name was Minnie Marvin Wheeler, also known as Mrs. Blakemore Wheeler. She was one of Louisville's Norton family members, and she inherited a lot of money. And she, over the years, bought Impressionist paintings, all of which are now at the Speed Art Museum on the walls. Her name, but if you see the name Mrs. Blakemore Wheeler, that is Minnie. Anyway, as I think David told you all, Robinson wrote angry letters to Abraham Lincoln because these troops bivouacked in what is now Central Park were disturbing the peace of his wife and children in the house. He also wrote some important pieces. He is regarded as a very smart, high-powered theologian, but and his probably greatest book is called, or tract is called Discourses on Redemption. No, I've not read it. I have read one, though, called, Mosaic Slavery. And this is where he found justification in the Bible for enslavement. And it's a very controversial book to this day. One of the interesting things in our church's history is that in 1930, the church celebrated its 100th anniversary. And in that, the book the Mosaic Slavery book is simply referred to as a book which has attained worldwide renown. And that's, I think, a very polite way of putting it, even in that era. Another fascinating thing about him is, I said he was a litigant. There was a time during the war when a group of Confederates did indeed send blankets poisoned with yellow fever to Union troops. Stuart Robinson was not among them, and a jury proved that. Nevertheless, about 10 years later, several newspapers claimed that he was part of that. The feisty and principled Stuart turned right around and sued them for defamation of character. And he recovered the jury verdict of $25,000 at the time. Today, that would be worth about $635,000. He also became part of a group of former Confederates or Confederate sympathizers who achieved huge positions of prominence in Kentucky. Those included governors, some senators, and he was at the intellectual epicenter of it. In addition, he was joined in all this by his son-in-law, a member of this church, a man named Bennett. It'll come to me. I'll get to that in a second. But Stuart Robinson led second into what is known as the Presbyterian Church of the United States. This is the Southern Presbyterian Church. The Northern Presbyterian Church was the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, the PCUSA. Those two churches ultimately merged in what, 1988? Yeah. And it was all those discussions were ongoing as Elizabeth and I were engaged in the process of getting married. And I have to say, I didn't pay a lot of attention to church affairs at the time. Other thing that Stuart Robinson did that is important in water is he built the church with the help of other people in the congregation, of course, but also because he, through his investments in real estate, he made a lot of money. And so he contributed to the building of the 1874 Gothic building of Second Pres. And there you see it. You can see it better if you go in the parlor and it's hanging on the wall in there. Now, I also want to say about his son-in-law, who was, on the right name, Bennett Young. Bennett is a fascinating character in his own right. Stuart Robinson had two daughters, one of whom married Bennett Young, who had been a Confederate officer, and Bennett led a group of Confederates to Canada, and they invaded St. Albans, Vermont. And they went to a bank in St. Albans and stole the gold that was in the bank, and then turned it over to the Confederacy. Bennett then ultimately, as did Stuart, they were pardoned by Andrew Johnson and they came back. Bennett Young is an interesting guy. He was very active in the Sons of the Confederacy. His wife was very active in the Daughters of the Confederacy. Bennett Young was one of the chairmen for raising the money that went to the creation of the Jefferson Davis Monument, which is 10 miles outside Hopkinsville, where growing up, we used to have church picnics before we got liberal ministers. Then that went by the wayside. Stuart also was, going back to Reverend Robinson, he was famous for his Wednesday night lectures. He was famous for the volumes of books and treatises that he wrote are mind-boggling. And he was a moderator of the Presbyterian Church in the U.S. That's a big deal. And they had a general assembly of that church here in Louisville at Second Presbyterian Church during his ministry. He also rejected all efforts to reunite with the Northern Church. He was really viscerally upset by being told that you have to swear allegiance to the Union when that was not what he believed. And he's not alone, and we should not kid ourselves here. What may seem now troubling and just not good in our eyes. And indeed, there was a strong abolitionist movement at the time. They knew what the issues were. It is simply that it was a different age. And, I think I told you all earlier, my Clay family's history with slavery goes all the way back to 1619. Every generation in my family owned other human beings. So who am I to judge any of this in hindsight, other than if I think personal reparations are in order, then I've made them. In any event, he unsuccessfully resisted the northern church's effort to own and control Center College and the Danville Seminary. So the northern church kept Center and kept what was then called the Danville Seminary. Stuart Robinson tried to build a new southern seminary in Richmond, Virginia, but that was ultimately a failure at the time. Then he retires and then quickly dies. There is, I think, at least one short-termer, perhaps an unintentional interim, and then we go to what is, I think, one of the crowning jewels, one of the most important ministries in the history of Second, and that is this gentleman, Dr. Charles Hemphill. He also made the window of sacred humanism. You'll see him right over here. Why is he important? Why does he matter? Essentially, it's because he single-handedly set an example of reuniting the northern and the southern churches. He was born in 1852. He died in 1932. He received his education from Columbia Seminary, which at that time was in South Carolina. He had a deep, deep understanding and love of biblical languages. He received a doctorate in biblical languages from Johns Hopkins, and then he taught Hebrew and Greek at Johns Hopkins and several other places before coming to Second, thanks, Jim, and serving as pastor of Second Presbyterian for 14 years, from 1885 to 1899. It was a significant pastor. From Second, he then became, and while he was at Second, he was a professor at what is now Global Presbyterian Theological Seminary. And that started in 1893 in the basement of Second Presbyterian Church at Second and Broadway. Dr. Hemphill is the person who opened that basement up, brought seminary learned people in that he had known in his career to teach, and they started attracting students. Then in 1899, he left and he went over to the seminary as a full-time professor. And then in 1900, he became the president of Global Presbyterian Center. Up to that point in time, committees had run the seminary rather than a president, and he became that. He also served as moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church U.S. in 1895. So that gives you two pastors of Second who served the denomination, the southern one, but nevertheless, the denomination as moderators. It's a big deal. It's something to be proud of. During Hemphill's ministry, significant things occurred. I've told you about Bennett Young. Bennett was on the session, and Bennett resisted what ultimately happened. And that is that under Dr. Hemphill, the Danville Seminary, which was struggling, and the Louisville Seminary, which was growing, merged. And Young had resisted that, and I mean, the arguments are classic, and you've heard them all before. Anytime anyone wants to do anything, oh, they're enveloped in debt. Oh, they don't have enough people. Oh, they're failing. Blah, da, 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 da. But this was inspired, and he did it for two reasons, I think, really, based on what I've read, and that is, one, the denominations, Northern and Southern, needed more pastors. There was a clamor for them. It was a different time in this nation's history. Then also, it was just a decent, honorable thing to do. And if you look at Hemphill's writings, what others have said about him, this was a really wonderful man. So in 1901, the two seminaries emerged. The Danville Seminary closed down physically and moved to Louisville. And then the seminary itself became governed not only by the Southern Church, but by the Northern Church as well. And this was a historic first. It also set the tone for what happened later over the years in Kentucky as a border state. My own dear First Presbyterian Church in Hopkinsville was originally, I never get this right, it became, as I was growing up, it was subject to the jurisdiction of both the Southern and the Northern churches. And I think almost all the churches in Kentucky followed the same pattern. Also, there is something else that Hemphill did, and that is, while he was pastor, a number of other churches were created by Second. Those include the Stuart Robinson Memorial Church, Westminster Presbyterian, which I don't think is around anymore, Highland Presbyterian, and Crescent Hill Presbyterian churches. This church has a well-deserved reputation as being the mother of Presbyterian churches in the city. Hemphill also had the good fortune to have a free kindergarten created by a woman named Mary Hill, one of the sisters of Patty Hill, who wrote the Happy Birthday song. He is considered to have been a splendid administrator. He had a docket for session meetings, an agenda. He created different organizational groups for women, which were the precursors of our circles. And he ran a businesslike and responsible church. He is described by the church historian who did our history in 1980, Lewis Weeks, as a learned, gifted preacher and theologian, and a very, quote, gentle, pious man who was beloved by the congregation. As president of Louisville Presbyterian, he also became and proved to be an adroit fundraiser. And he got people with money from both the northern and the southern churches to give heavily to the creation of the seminary. And it was on his watch that the Gothic building at First and Broadway, across from the second church at Second and Broadway, was built. That building is still there. It's just now part of Jefferson Community College. Yeah, I never get the terms. I'm never quite sure about them. So anyhow, I talked with Lewis today, and I also visited. In preparation, I went to Stuart Robinson's house, which was a treat. I talked to Lewis Weeks and just thanked him for his ministry. Lou was the dean of the seminary at LPTS and also a church historian. He then went on to Richmond and became the president of Union Theological Seminary. He's now retired. He and his wife live in Williamsburg. He is as bright and alive and kicking as anybody I've talked to in ages, and sends his best to this congregation. He also asked, has my book ever been published? And I said, no. I mean, it's in, it's in a binder. And I said, there are a couple of them in the library. And I had to, it's all I could do to keep a straight face. His comment was, well, Glenn didn't want it published, And I said, why? And he said, well, I think I didn't glorify Glenn enough. Anyway, it's proven helpful to David Ratterman and to me as well. Anyway, he also stayed involved in this Dr. Hemphill and involved in the life of Second. Now, I'm not sure if I was a bright young pastor, if I would particularly like it if my predecessor was hanging around like that closed ghost. But that happened here. That Dr. Hemphill was so beloved, and the people who followed him were they were just happy to have him, and they were happy to have the relationship with the seminary. The next person, there's Dr. Hemphill. And then here we go to the Reverend Egbert Smith. He made the window. Oddly, the person who was pastor when the church was founded, Eli Sawtell, is not in the window. Do not ask me why. Elizabeth told me that they probably ran out of room, but I honestly don't know. And then here is Egbert. I'm not too happy with the way his beard turned out, but there he is in all of his glory. He was the pastor from 06 to 1911, and he, according to Lou Weeks, was known as a fire and brimstone preacher. And during those 5 years, he preached fire and brimstone, and then he left to become the Secretary of Foreign Missions in the Presbyterian Church US, the Southern Church. He was a graduate of Davidson and of Union Theological Seminary in Virginia. During his pastorate, something very significant happened. That happened again, a little, roughly 75 years later. Anyone know what it was? The church burned down. So in 1874, the Stuart Robinson Church burned, and it burned badly, but insurance covered almost all of it, and the church got busy and rebuilt. Much was saved, and everything then went on. Reverend Smith had an interest in evangelism, and he actually saw to it that Second support a missionary named John Little, who worshiped in the congregation and advocated and helped build up support and supplies for Louisville's Black population. I honestly don't know if Reverend Little was white or Black. I think he was white. Then Smith also hired Second's first female staff member. Now, we have had many female staff members in this church, but this one takes the cake. Her name was Mrs. Munger, and Mrs. Munger was the superintendent of what we'll call the beginners department in the Sunday school. She was paid also to, quote, find strangers coming to town, end quote. Invite them to worship and work in the church. She positioned herself, just see this, she positioned herself right away at the front door of worship services as a sort of people greeter with Walmart. It didn't take long for the session to become alarmed by this sort of unseemly practice. And she was required to terminate her employment after a number of old garters on the session complained. I want to return for a moment to the burning of the church. We met for an entire year at the invitation of the neighboring Baruch Shalom congregation. which was right behind it. Our church faced second and Broadway, and then this church was behind whatever the next street is. And that, at the time, and still is, the largest Jewish congregation in Louisville. It is now what we know as the Temple. This has proven a durable partnership over the years between this church and the Temple. We have our ministers talk to each other, interact with each other. Jim Rittenhouse occasionally sings in their choir at the Temple. That we have much to learn from them. It could be an even more fruitful relationship than it is, but that's where the real history started. Now let's move on to Dr. John Vandermeulen, and he is another very interesting and highly influential member of this church and of pastor. Only here for 5 years, from 1912 to 1917, but his influence was far greater than that pastorate might imply at first glance. He was born in Milwaukee in 1870. He was reared through almost all of his childhood in the Dutch Reformed area of Western Michigan. That means places like Holland and Kalamazoo and Grand Rapids, that area. He received his A.B. from Hope College in Holland, and then he spent 2 years in Princeton, but ultimately got his divinity degree from McCormick Seminary in Chicago. He had pastored in Reformed churches, that is Dutch Reform, which are so close to Congregationalism and Presbyterianism that there has been movement over the years among pulpits in all three of those denominations. He moved to Louisville in 1912, and he is described by the Weeks as a man of warm personality, an eloquent preacher, and a good administrator. His ministry was a time of great activity, great spiritual growth, and good finances. He added 112 people to the congregation during his 5 years, and he tripled it. He made a significant contribution to the life of Second in other ways as well. For example, another church was born, and that is the Buchel Presbyterian Church, came from members of Second. And then in 1917, he was called to the Oak Park Presbyterian Church in Chicago. It's the second largest church. It was at the time and probably still is. He remained there 3 years, and then he came back to Louisville to be president of Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. His former congregation at Second was overjoyed because he, like Dr. Hemphill, was beloved. And he remained president of LPTS from 1920 to 1930, and he died in 1936 and was buried at Cave Hill. During his ministry, and there's Dr. Vandermeulen again, and then let's see if this comes up. Yeah, there we go. Oops. Okay. We had World War I started, and then it was finished under the ministry of his successor. But you'll see this plaque out in the hall. 79 men and 10 women members of this church answered to the call of their country to fight for the freedom of the world. 3 made the supreme sacrifice. In loving remembrance of their heroism, a grateful people inscribes their names hereon. Joseph Conway Dodd Jr., Samuel Arch Campbell Jr., John William Klein Jr. If you look over here, you see an American flag. It was under Dr. Hempel's watch that the American flag first went up in the sanctuaries of Second, and has been a continuing tradition ever since. Then, let's see what the war ended under the ministry of Dr. Dunbar Ogden, who followed Hemphill, but was only here for a couple of years. So in the interest of time, I didn't include it. But now let's move on to this fellow, Dr. Tunis Gowans. Tunis Gowans, does that sound sort of Dutch as well? He was. And what we have here is a tradition at Second and at Louisville Presbyterian of a strong Dutch Reformed strain or strand in how we as a congregation look at life. And weeks in 1980 saw Second as clearly within what would be called the Reformed theological view of the Bible and of ministry. And also that, I mean, Weeks makes no bones about it. He says it is, at least in 1980, a relatively conservative church in that respect. And throughout these ministries, you see, beginning with Eli Sawtell, certainly, and Stuart Robinson, all the way up, a very strong relationship between Second Presbyterian Church and Louisville's business and professional communities. And there, you know, I've heard it say, well, we have so many leaders, no one can do anything. I think that's inaccurate, but it is Second has always been a church that has attracted people who in one way or another have led in what they do. And that's not a bad thing. The thing perhaps that changed has been that Louisville's business and professional communities have changed so dramatically since 1980 that there is no longer, you know, a tight control by you know, a group of, you know, a large group of families that is now much more spread out. And a lot of the businesses that were locally owned are no longer locally owned. In any event, Tunis, he preached the sermon, no, I'm sorry, at his installation, Dr. Vandermeulen preached the installation sermon, and Dr. Hemphill, who was still alive, delivered the charge to the congregation. And that is going to repeat itself in Barrett's installation, because Andrew Palmerville, the president of Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, will do Barrett's installation sermon at a worship service. What's the date, Barrett? 19. So that also cemented the continuing relationship between Second and LPTS. Gowans is described by Lou Weeks, based on interviews, as having a quiet but an authoritative pastor role style. He retired in December 1948. And so, Barrett, this gives him a record-holding position in the church. He was pastor 27 years, which is longer than any other minister in the history of Second. Yeah, just put that in your head. I want to go.
The challenge has been.
I talked to Elizabeth Haynes about him today. She remembers him when she was 12 or 13. I went over and if you have a chance, okay, this is one of the brightest women in the whole church. She's not, Barrett's been to see her, Andrew's been to see her, Elizabeth goes to see her. She's 99 years old. And she is, I hope I have that kind of brain when I'm 99. She grew up in the church. She's been a member ever since, except for a brief temptation at St. Francis in the Fields, which she got over. And that was just because she was worn out here with committees. Think of what Gallon's encountered. He encountered the Great Depression. He encountered the 1937 flood, and he encountered World War II. He encouraged the session to start a poor fund for members of the church adversely affected by the Depression. That's what they called a poor fund. But things were so bad then that be grateful for it. During the Great Flood, Second suffered about $6,500 worth of damage back then. Don't know what that would be now. Some water stood in the basement in the lower portion of the main auditorium, damaged carpet. So new carpet had to be purchased. Church organ mechanism had to be reconstructed. But we maintained. Gallons worked with the seminary across the street to create a Presbyterian flood relief committee that then doled out money across Louisville for adversely affected congregations and just people in need. During World War II, on 2nd and Broadway, the church turned its basement over, no longer to a seminary, but this time to veterans or not veterans, World War II recruits who were coming into Louisville for training in Fort Knox. And then they would come into Louisville on weekends. They would stay in the church's basement. The church would feed them good meals. And then they'd be invited to church on Sundays into people's homes. And it was a big deal. The women of the church started a Red Cross chapter. Members made bandages and learned first aid. It was an important and unifying time. That takes us then into, there's Tunis. And Elizabeth described him as, high-powered, tightly wound. He would get over the circle, over his lectern, grab the pulpit, put one leg up, he'd start moving around. And she said he was a dynamic evangelist and a great preacher. And she loved him and the congregation loved him, but they also found him, he looked so friendly there and nice. And she said he was, to her, as a 13-year-old girl, he was an intimidating presence. She said, well, he seemed as tall as Glenn Dorst, but then I was little. And then this is the, see if I can get it to go. Yeah, there you go. World War II. This is the plaque opposite the World War I plaque. I'll read it. This tablet is erected to honor the 133 young men and women from this church who heard our country's call and entered service in the great global war for the freedom of the world and the preservation of our Christian ideals. 4 noble young men made the supreme sacrifice, and in loving remembrance, this congregation inscribes their names through art. Ellis S. Allen Jr., John McDougall Atherton, Ralph C. Gifford Jr., and Bethel Beach Otter. And some of those names, Allen, Atherton, and Beach, are major names in the history of this church. And then this is Dr. Clark, who was minister here from 1950 to 1968, and was from Scotland, and was met during the war by Tom Tyrrell's father, Gerald, who helped recruit him back in the days before big search committees to come to Second. And he was here with Mrs. Clark for all those 18 years. And then it was during his ministry that this chapel was built, that it became the main building sanctuary for the church, because right as people moved here, the old church burned completely down at Second and Broadway. It was a miracle. And then there's Dr. Clark. And then we go to Glenn. Glenn Doris was here from 1968 to 88. It was a 20-year pastorate. How many people were members here when Glenn was pastor? And me, Elizabeth, yeah, a lot of us were. And a lot of us have different reactions to him at various times. Theologically, he couldn't have been better. You listen to sermons and they were meaty, powerful, beautifully delivered. And his favorite topic, I think, was grace. He talked about it all the time. He is in the window there, and that was put in after he retired, shortly after he retired. And he's holding a baby. His favorite thing to do was baptisms. He loved them. There's nothing he loved better than a good baptism. Glenn, it's fair to say, in Glenn's 15th year, he had a nervous breakdown. He was taken to the Menninger Clinic and was there for a good 6 months. Frances, his wife, went with him, and the church maintained the session, had guest preachers, and we also had 2 younger ministers, Brett Morgan and Don Richter. Many of you will know Don, and maybe many of you will remember Brett. They were my age. And they both did, I thought, very fine jobs in maintaining the church and the congregation in those 2. The last 5 years were not as good as the first 15, perhaps. When you look at his legacy, probably the sanctuary, regardless of the leak, under the steeple right now. That he was the minister who spearheaded the building of the sanctuary, and this wing out here, what is now the parlor, was his office. And he also did some other things that I think were useful. The session had 45 people on it. He thought that was important, that everyone from the church be heard. For the first time, women were put on the session. He had visions, and the visions were that we would found some other churches. That was one of them. He wanted us to find a way to unite with a congregational church in Louisville, a UCC church. And for a while, we had UCC hymnals in the pews. he was creative. The last 5 years, I think the church ministered to him. There were a lot of people, and me included from time to time, who just wished, oh, please retire. But we knew it would happen, and the church could not have been kinder to a minister. We found that we could care for a minister as opposed to always thinking that it was the minister's job to care for us. So it's on that note that I'll end. I don't know how we are on time. We're close. Are there any questions I can answer in a short period of time? Dr. Jones.
So I like scoundrels more than saints. So I want to ask you about Mr. Robinson. But would you first, before I ask this, so I do it intelligently, tell me, make sure I understand. After the Civil War, he returned and reestablished until 1888.
Right.
Okay. So I want to ask about him and the congregation, and if you found anything in your reading about this. So he's ministered through slavery, through war, through emancipation, through Appomattox, through Reconstruction, through Ku Klux Klan, through Jim Crow. And he's a noisy guy. He likes to write, he has lots of opinions, and he says, is there any evidence that he evolved? Or what the church,
the evidence,
controversies?
I think the evolution of the church took place under Hemphill, who was born and raised in South Carolina. I don't think the evolution of the church happened under Stuart Robertson. I do think that important things happened that were good. Those would include the building of the sanctuary. Those would include apparently powerful sermons and lectures that attracted people and that people gained from. There was a significant departure when he came back to Canada. A group of parishioners left, wanted no part of him, and went to what was known as the College Street Presbyterian Church, which had northern sympathies. So second was, in many ways, as a result, a more conservative institution. I hate to use a word like conservative or liberal, a more traditionally Southern institution, I think is the way I would put it. And it's odd that that would happen because he was born in Ireland, lived there until he was 4 or 5, and then came over, was raised in the Shenandoah Valley, and went to Amherst. Now, was Amherst to the college then that Amherst is now, which is one of the preeminent liberal arts colleges in the country? I don't know. I think the attitude as I've wrestled with this, ultimately it is, with all of my prejudice, biases that Elizabeth has to live with daily, who am I to judge? Okay? Who am I to judge, my family from the vantage point of all these years?
But some people spoke with their feet.
Speak up.
Some people spoke with their feet.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did, quite a few. And then the church had to rebuild.
I just wonder, the Jewish temple that you mentioned, is that the one at Lime Kiln?
Yes, it's the one at Lime Kiln and Brownsboro Road. Anybody else? All right. Hey, thank you all. So that you'll know it's not my scholarship. right, this is a 1930 centennial history of Second Church. I can't wait to take this back to the library and just do this. This is Lewis Weeks' book, Kentucky Presbyterians, and it's a history of the Presbyterian Church in Kentucky. This is a book I didn't know about until Elizabeth told me 2 nights ago. It's called Many Lamps, One Light. It's by Rick Nutt. I don't think a relation to Grady.
No.
Or Toby. But this is Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, a 150th anniversary history. So this was written in 2000, I think.
2003.
2000, yeah, 2003.
He was a history professor at Muskingum College and a Louisville Seminary grad.
All right. And another thing here is, remember this Dutch Reformed strand in second. Don't forget John Mulder, who came to us from that same Dutch Reformed tradition, and brought, he was in the shoes of John Vanderbilt. When you think of it that way, and James Jones. Then this was written in 2005 for the church's 175th anniversary. This is the one for our wonderful Steve Lynch, who's the search committee I chaired, and I loved the guy, I still do. Steve is quoted as saying, "We are who we are." And then this is a fun book, and I'll put this back in the library. I passed it around the last time, but it shows just historical pictures of the church that are interesting and fun to look at. So there we go. Natalie, it's time for you to get to choir girl.
14 minutes.
Of the one in Second and Broadway? Is that what the pictures are?
Yeah, a lot are at Second and Broadway. Some are in here. And the interesting thing is, I love it. If someone can tell me, this room, when first built, was architecturally different. These, is it pronounced pilaster or pilaster? The columns against the wall, pilaster. They had Corinthian capitals on them. And there was a door here, a window there, a door over there, a window over it. And instead of this arch, I mean, the arch ceiling was always here, but instead of this arch, it's straight across, and then the walls come out to about here, I guess, to hide the choir.
Well, Jack, if you go downstairs by the weekday school door and look up, there are windows in the brick wall that are.
That explains it, because they're here. Where is that? I'll find it and I'll put it. Will anyone fuss at me if I just leave it here on the harpsichord for a minute? Let me find it, because it's a very interesting thing to see what it looked like.
Here it is. Maybe when the big church burned and this became the permanent one, that they redid it at some point.
Can you see it?
I think it was just a style change.
Oh, yeah.
It's quite different.
The walls are darker. Is that paint or is it
No,
wood?
it's black and white, but it's probably, I bet there was a curtain back there. Like some dark velvet thing. Out here, I'll give this.
It's kind of like the tables.
We'll pass it around. But don't spend too long on it, because I'm going to have to, it goes back to the library too. You're welcome. Oh, Second Presbyterian Church's archives. Listen good. Second Presbyterian Church's archives are at the Filson Historical Society. The only things that are not at the Filson are the church minutes. When the church burned, well, I don't know if it was burn number 1 or burn number 2, but a lot of the church archives and minutes were lost. So there is a gap, sadly, that covers a lot of the Civil War. That's just not there anymore.